Let's get started. Our welcome to the first panel on the people formerly known as the audience. This panel is an exercise in concept theft, or as we call it, user-generated content. The name of the panel itself is stolen from Dan Gillmor. The phrase "the former audience" or the people formerly known as the audience is thanks to Dan, our first panelist. Dan is currently at the Knight Center for Digital Media Entrepreneurship at Arizona State University after doing several other interesting things in journalism and related to citizen journalism. Second, we have Steve Boriss, who runs a blog called The Future of News and a consultancy called The Future of News, so we've stolen that from him.
That's right.
And third is Reihan Salam, and we haven't yet decided what to steal from him. He is a digital strategist for the Atlantic Monthly. Rather than spend a lot of time on introducing the panelists, let them do the talking. So we'll invite each panelist to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion on the panel and Q&A. Dan Gillmor's first. And also let me also mention that Dan unfortunately has to leave promptly after the panel. So if he runs out, he's not running away from you.
Thank you, Ed, and especially for that last thing. I don't want you to think I'm rude, but I have a train I have to catch, and I really hate leaving because the rest of this thing looks so good. Also, I want to give Jay Rosen at least equal credit for the people formerly known as the audience. He put in the little Prince thing there. I called it the former audience. Jay called it the people formerly known as the audience. And so we should both get credit, if any credit should be given at all. I'm going to whip through in 15 minutes what I normally take an hour to do. This is somewhat impressionistic, so please understand that a lot of this is just pictures, but I think I'm trying to get the lay of the land of media transition and how this is all happening. So I'm going to go through things rather quickly, but first, what I'm not saying is that this is perfect. This is just not perfect. There's a lot of problems. I'll refer to a couple of them, but please don't call me Pollyannish about this. I recognize the issues, and they're pretty profound ones, but I'm enthralled by the possibilities. But the shift, this is in contrast to Professor Starr's wonderful book, which is really better history. This is my brief history of media, and here we are. So anyone who wants this, I'll give it to you later. This is really interesting, what this does. It's completely different from the past. It's about a democratized media, not so much voting, though there's a piece of it, but the participation, and that's both in production. The tools are in everyone's hands, and something different than distribution. We think still about we produce it and then distribute it, but actually we produce it and then we make it available. And that's a different model than distributing. And we should think about it. Some of it is distributed, but a lot of it is simply put out for people to find and get for themselves. It's a read-write web, and that turns the consumer into a creator. And I think even more importantly and interestingly, the creator into a collaborator. And to me, that's really where it gets exciting. Here's some pictures as data of where we are and where we're going. Some things that I think are distinctly part of that. That's podcasts from Africa, an extraordinary thing we never used to see. Any Warcraft people in here? I feel sorry for you if you are, because you don't have time for your other work. The tsunami, of course, as captured by people at the scene. We're going to be getting some of this soon. And we're actually seeing some of it already coming out of China and Burma. This is a constant refrain. Part of this is the daily me, the idea we create our own report from a variety of sources. But the converse of the daily me is the fact that if we're doing blogs and other kinds of personal media, we're creating something like that. It's called RSS, that other people use to pull into their own daily me. And it's not something we have to think about. We just do it. It's automatic. It's baked in to the software. We're creating as we do things. But of course not just me. There's the we is more important. So there's all kinds of things going on, and I can only touch on a few of them. And again, there's a tremendous potential going on here. But the word community matters a great deal to me. And we should be thinking very much about communities, both of interest and geography and combinations of those. The question keeps getting asked, who is a journalist? I don't care. It's what is journalism? That I do care. And so that's journalism. We agree, right? That's not journalism. We can probably agree. You know, that's not journalism. It's something. It's just media. But it's not. What about this? Not by a journalist, but by someone who was there in the London Underground. The canonical image from that day. It became part of journalism, though he was not and has not since been a journalist. Professor Starr mentioned Josh Marshall, a brilliant journalist who happens to do it in this medium called a blog. But what about Ed Felton's media? What about NGOs doing things? What about think tanks and other kinds of organizations doing things that have a point of view, but maybe they're journalism in a sense too? What about blogs by corporates? I'm not claiming these are all journalism, but they're closer to it than the old PR of the past and some of the things that used to go on. You're creating media now. Some of it's getting into this territory. It's blurring, and we have principles that are all, these are the old-fashioned journalistic principles, these four, and we can't disagree with them. They're very important. For all of these other things, we add a new one for this time, transparency, and then I think we start to solve the problem of worrying more about what the journalism is than who is the journalist. It's not perfect, but it's getting closer. I think Kevin this morning said and, not or. Please think of this as ecosystem that's getting more diverse. Yes, we're losing some things that are critical and we don't want to lose them permanently. But there's a more diverse and I think vibrant media ecosystem developing if we get it right. And it's all rooted in this idea of changing from lecture to conversation. And the first rule of the conversation, listen. Traditional journalists aren't that good at this, but I think we're learning in general. So the media are adapting. The Wall Street Journal has blogs, database journalism by the Washington Post and others where they're creating something new and it can only live on the web. And they're learning that they're not oracles, they're guides as much as oracles. This is a profoundly important change for the traditional media, to recognize that there's other stuff out there and to use that elemental thing called the hyperlink. My God, it's God's gift for getting it right. So people in news organizations pointing to others in Sweden, Aftonbladet, points to blogs in Sweden, including the ones written by their competitors. Of course they should. Send people away, they'll come back. You got to go way further than this, and it's part of the we part, the Tunisian prison map created by people, some of whom had been in these prisons, some of which the government thought were a secret. Well, they're not a secret to people who were in them. That's something new. That's a form of journalism that's happening. One of my favorite trivial examples, in a sense, is what is done by a newspaper in California, a pothole map, where they asked the community to help. Where are the potholes? And the community said, everywhere. Well, this is something that is possible now in all sorts of media, not just them. And then there's the idea of combining media of various kinds in the mashup culture that people under 20 certainly get, but people older are still learning about. And that includes this wonderful mashup of, if you recall, when Tony Blair was agonizing over when he would step down.
I'd actually like to start by saying, darling, you've got to let me know. Should I stay or should I go?
A video by someone with a lot of time on his hands, but a wonderful piece of commentary using traditional media, old media, all sorts of media into something new and I think quite wonderful. Going further, the audience, remember, it's the former audience. The news media are starting to get it. I'm so happy about that. The paper in Florida that asked the readers to help investigate local government story and got a tremendous response, full of great stuff. Dallas Morning News. got a trove of new or old documents about the Kennedy assassination and put them online and said, you help us figure out what's in here. It's too much for us. Not enough of us. There's not enough journalists, period. So let's ask for help. Josh Marshall did that, as Professor Starr noted, and continues to do it. The standard now is to get pictures from and videos from people in unusual conditions. But a newspaper in Germany, a tabloid that loves to write about celebrities, they went one step further. They realized that the chances were someone with a mobile phone camera would be at the scene when a celebrity showed his face in public. Much higher chance of that than a paparazzi being there. So they said to the readers, hey, you all be the paparazzi, and we'll pay you. The real innovation was that last line, we'll pay you. Important. A business model that says you do all the work, we'll take all the money, thank you very much, is neither fair nor sustainable, in my opinion. But whether media ask, people do it anyway. A building after a bombing in Jakarta, this was done before the media were at the scene, but it's part of the media flow. And please remember, it's not new. But it's new in character, and I'll explain that. But that took the most important pictures of these kinds, or the most known pictures. Of course, that was the assassination of Kennedy. The difference between then and a few years from now is in Dallas in '63, there's one guy with a movie camera capturing this terrible sequence. 10 years from now, in a horrific or noteworthy event, there will be 1,000 people with high-definition video cameras, and those cameras will be all connected to high-speed digital networks. That's really different, and we have to figure out what it means and what it will do. But I'll ask you to remember to think about one other thing. September 11th, 2001, the people on those airplanes were making phone calls, voice calls with their mobile phones. What if they'd been sending real-time videos of what was going on inside those planes? The media of the future are something like that is going to be part of where we are. This is part of the problem area we don't know how to solve. Not only too much information, we don't know if it's accurate, and in Photoshop world, digital world, we get fake composites like this that raced around the web, and some people probably still think it was real. And so what do we have to do? We have to help consumers of news get some principles. And those are pretty hard ones in some ways, but be skeptical of everything, but not equally skeptical of everything. And use your own judgment, use your own reporting, and learn the techniques, including the technique of how media are used to persuade and manipulate, not just how to create a video. There's more work for the consumer now. Sorry. It's just the truth. But we have tools developing to help us along. Something like News Trust, which I'm advising. I recommend you take a look at newstrust.net. We're helping people to find what's good, what's not. Starting to move toward a daily us. Voting at Dig and sites like it, it's not enough to vote. Popularity is not enough. But if we add reputation, we're going to be onto something very, very cool. Although that sounds easy and is spectacularly difficult, the computer programmers in the room will understand that as a non-trivial problem. It's super non-trivial. But it's also going to be a big business for whoever gets it right. The bad news, good news in the business area, here's the lousy data. We're all in trouble in traditional media because of competitors like eBay, which is classified advertising dressed up as an auction. And Craigslist. Craig is a friend of mine, and we advise each other on stuff. But the fact is that the business model is changing because advertising is being systematically separated from the traditional journalism. But that's not such a problem in the end if we start thinking about it. It's everybody, by the way, is the competitor. Anyone who thinks Google is not a competitor to a news organization is crazy. And it's going really quickly. But I'm telling students the career ladder I got on is basically gone or going. But the best time ever for them to invent their own jobs. And that's part of what I'm trying to help happen. This has never been so easy because you can do things for a very low cost, except your time. It doesn't cost anything to try stuff. You can try things simply and easily with the digital tools of the age, and it's only getting simpler and easier and cheaper all the time. So people are bootstrapping companies together, new startups, niche, highly targeted niche that go very deep kinds of journalism. Like this one, there's an advertising thing that actually works. The more targeted and the deeper your journalism is, the more likely it is that the people who care about that much, that they will read something like that, will find advertising not just annoying, but actually perhaps kind of content. And it raises its own set of problems, but it's something not to ignore. And by the way, not everything needs a business model. Some people do it because they love their communities. There's no business model for community theater, yet people all over do it. Let's not assume everything has to have a business model in the for-profit world. Nonprofit journalism, as was said earlier, is going to be a big, big thing. And here's another example that I think has great promise, Global Voices. Some places that this is a couple of things I've been thinking about hard, and one is the sort of idea of Where 2.0 and moving into mobile, which is clearly becoming a platform. Yes, it's sometimes kind of trivial, but it's sometimes not. This is a project that a bunch of people did in San Diego a year and a half ago, brought together government, military, NGOs, Microsoft, Google, a bunch of people who don't normally sit in the same room together to work on disaster recovery scenario. My little piece of it was to create a citizen media element of texting into a gateway with a street address in the text message saying what's happening there. And it was a little complicated, but we ended up making something out of that. The phones that are being sold today have GPS built into them. You don't need to do the street address anymore. Great potential here. Just incredible things we can do. Another project that worked on recently, a guy at Dartmouth, Quintus Jett, is mapping housing conditions in the Gentilly district of New Orleans, one of the harder hit areas, and ranking them along a scale. And we took some students down there and first of all pulled his data into a map and then took pictures of a bunch of the houses. Couldn't do the whole 16,000 district, but we did some to get ideas of it, and then interviewed people. And the next step, if we can ever get it done, will be to put a front end on this so that the people will do what makes most sense, which is to tell their own stories instead of us having to go interview them. Why don't they just fill in the rest themselves if they choose to? This is the possibilities that you can see out there. So I just want to that was as fast as I've ever done that. Holy mackerel. Again, there are enormous problems with all of this, but the opportunities to get this right, I think, have never been greater. And I do strongly believe that this expanding, diversifying ecosystem in the end is just going to change things for a very good way, and that yes, the interim is going to be messy. That's the best we can say. But I'm quite hopeful that we're going to come out of it because of the former audience being part of the journalism of the future, that we're going to come out of it with more, better information. And so that's why I'm an optimist, and call me crazy, but I think we're going to get this right. Thank you. Yeah, well, actually, he's coming. Okay, good.
Here's this. Goes in there. Yeah, my name is Steve Boriss, and as has been pointed out, this workshop did steal its name from my blog and from my consultancy, The Future of News. But one thing it didn't steal was the name of the panel, the people formerly known as the audience, because I personally don't think they're going anywhere. As a matter of fact, I think we're going to have a lot more audiences. I share Dan's optimism. I think we are about to enter a golden age of news, both for news audiences and also for people who want to write for a public. I think we're entering a period where it will be the best time in history. I'll tell you a little bit about myself real quickly. I teach a class. I've been teaching a class for a few years now at Washington University in St. Louis called The Future of News. And unless you've read my blog, I think you're going to see some things in this short presentation that you probably haven't seen before. And the reason is that I took, when the decision was made I was going to teach this class, I undertook a year's worth of research and decided to look at the future of news from a very multidisciplinary perspective, bringing in business strategy, consumer marketing, finance history, journalism, of course, political science, psychology, and technology. And I came up with things that are a little bit different from some other things you'll see on the internet, and I'm going to share them with you. I have a blog called The Future of News. I write commentary daily, 1 comment per day, every day except Sunday. And what I have there, if you go there, you'll see my vision for the future of news. I just go ahead and lay it out on the line, a very broad framework. And every day I pull a story out of the headlines in this tiny little space called The Future of News and comment on it. I'm also a regular columnist for pajamasmedia.com, and as I mentioned, I now have a consultancy helping old media companies become new ones and new media companies to succeed. But I'm going to do this, I'm going to use the framework of the history that I went through to come up with the conclusions that I did. So I'm going to go way back 500 years before the printing press. So imagine there's no press, there's no newspapers. The only way for news to spread is by word of mouth. So that would make every one of us a sender and receiver of news. That didn't mean that everyone had the same clout or we were listened to as much as each other. There developed a marketplace where the people who were listened to the most tended to be those who were most trusted, reliable, you name it, entertaining, intelligent. And in this environment, there were governments, more oppressive governments than we're accustomed to today, but there were governments and they needed to be heard, and they really couldn't control word of mouth very easily, so they competed like everybody else. And when you read books about the colorfully garbed minstrels, that was really what that was about. That was government trying to get attention so they could get their word out, suppress, do all the good and bad things government does, suppress criticism, organize people for their efforts. So you had a news environment that was kind of like blogging, except it was unplugged. So, and that's a helpful perspective to keep as you think about where we're going into the future. The printing press, who can say anything bad about the printing press, except I will for a few seconds here. I mean, obviously a huge advance in human knowledge and humans' ability to follow news, but it also gave government an unprecedented opportunity to control news because these printing presses were large, they were hard to conceal, it was easy to figure out who was printing the news, and what do you know, in Europe and in colonial America, government started controlling news. They implemented licensing where in order to publish, you needed their permission, prior restraint, where they could look in advance of what you were publishing, and of course the punishments. And when you think about, in context, the American Revolution, that was really a pushback on government. It set back government control of news. Before the Revolution, famously, as we all learned in middle school, the John Peter Zenger trial allowed criticism of the government as long as it was true. And then we had a series of these events, Stamp Act, Townsend Acts, Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, that drummed up plenty of opposition against our British governors. Now, after the Revolution, we created an unprecedented new country. The First Amendment, sort of being the centerpiece of it, set new rules, not just for citizens, but also for news. We're to be a nation with maximum free expression, maximum debate leading to consent of the governed, where all of us as individuals had dignity. We had the rights to free speech, meaning everybody could verbally criticize the government. We had the right to free press, which is one of the most misinterpreted phrases in America today. What was meant in the first debate, in the First Amendment, was that was the right of each one of us to freely use a printing press, there being no press similar to what we have today. But that's what the country was set up to be. And Thomas Jefferson, when you read his letters, you can see what he thought the role of newspapers ought to be. He saw this as a free-for-all. Attack and defense is a phrase that he used often. That's what the newspapers were supposed to be doing. This was his belief not just about news, about life in general. In one letter to George Washington, he said, "Nature has given to man no other means of sifting out the truth, whether in religion, law, or politics." He wanted debate, he wanted attack, he wanted defense. And what he wanted mostly was this phrase that I overuse on my blog, a multitude of voices competing in a freewheeling marketplace of ideas. This is how America was set up. This is what the newspapers were to do. In the newspapers through the 19th century, we had our multitude of voices, and this is what Jefferson wanted. The founding fathers, not being hypocrites, founded their own very partisan newspapers. Alexander Hamilton had the Gazette of the United States for pro-federalist. Jefferson and Madison, not being happy with that, set up their own competing newspaper. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French historian, when he came by in the early 1800s, captured his thoughts in the two-volume set, Democracy in America. He marveled at our newspapers. He said he thought that they were uniquely able, when you went around the world, to attract and inspire the like-minded for political action. As the phrase he uses in the book is, newspapers make associations and associations make newspapers. And even people who didn't live next to each other necessarily. He liked the way they gathered people of like minds. Just another example, as we got to the late 1800s, you could see the papers all took sides pretty much. 31% of our newspapers supported Democrats, 43% Republicans. And here's an example from the Los Angeles Times. We can't imagine this today, but 1896, celebrating a Republican victory with dancing elephants on the front page. So this was our news throughout most of the 19th century. It was a multitude of voices competing in a freewheeling marketplace of ideas. Now, what happened in the 20th century, I kind of paint darkly. And this is a period that I think we're going to slowly recover from, or quickly recover from. If you go to my blog, you can actually read the article on it. 4 advances that set news back. There are 4 things I identified. They all sound wonderful, like wonderful things. In a lot of ways, they were wonderful things, but they weren't particularly kind to the news business, or at least to the multitude of voices that news had been. We had the steam engine harnessed to the printing press, bringing a lot of newspapers down to a penny apiece, bringing in lots and lots of people, particularly downscale, to participate in the news process. But we ended up with fewer voices ultimately, because the economics of the printing press required high circulations to get that price down. So whereas before we had a lot of printers, one-man shops, we went down to much, much fewer. We have the Associated Press, generally considered to be a very positive thing, where newspapers pooled their resources to greatly reduce their costs for news both domestically and abroad. But this reduced the number of voices, because what started happening is our newspapers started sharing stories. They stopped competing on the basis of alternate news stories and angles. In Dr. Starr's talk, he talked about the number of foreign bureaus that are closing. When you think about that, that's essentially because a lot of that work is now being outsourced to wire services like the Associated Press. But the point is reducing the number of voices to what ended up being a national conversation. Modern journalism. Walter Lippmann, I consider him to be the father of modern journalism. In the 1920 wrote a book called Liberty in the News, which has essentially been our model for journalism through today. What I believe Lippmann's ideas led to was transforming what had been a rough and tumble craft into a science. And it started appropriating scientific names, terms normally used in science, like objectivity and verification. And if you think about it, this is almost the antithesis of what Thomas Jefferson was looking for. He was not assuming there were right answers out there. He was looking for consent of the governed. He wanted a lot of debate. And now we had a discipline that was believing that there were such things as truths and objective ways of presenting facts, and essentially one answer. If you think about that, how do you then implement ideas like fair and balance when there's one answer? If there's one truth, why would you balance it with untruths? So it reduced the number of voices. There was less need for debate if we had journalists who purported to be acting as if their field is a science. And then finally, broadcasting. Almost upon its inception, its invention, government saw the broadcast spectrum as a precious resource and took it upon itself to regulate it, and specifically to issue licenses to broadcast networks that could then be renewed. But in my view, broadcast news had a chilling effect on debate, because it put the networks in a position where every few years they had to come back to the government to get their licenses renewed. And I think if you compare, for instance, I'm probably offending somebody in this room, I won't worry about it, but if you look at the hotness of the political debate on broadcast news versus cable, which is relatively unregulated, I think you'd have to agree that there's hotter political debate, more voices on cable than on broadcast news. So this, in my view, is sort of a return of the government control. They're kind of getting back in there so that in order for these major networks to continue to broadcast, they need some level of contentment on the part of politicians. And as a result, we ended up with something, 5 seconds or 5 minutes? Oh, we're fine. Okay, so the 4 advances. The internet is undermining the 4 advances. It's restoring our multitude of voices. This is the good news. Eliminates the need for high capital investment. To have a voice, you don't need a steam engine. You don't need a printing press. Internet offers alternative stories to the AP network's national conversation. We're starting to see some of the principles of modern journalism challenged, particularly that they provide truth all the time, as they purport to do, or their objective. 2/3 of the public no longer believes the news is unbiased. It's revealing some tastes that the public wants in news that have been denied by modern journalism. Facts combined with opinion, we're seeing a lot of that on the internet, a lot of preference for that. Some alternatives to the serious, authoritative, somewhat scolding style that modern journalism is associated with. And it's probably the biggest change of all is it's widening the definition of news. Whereas our news today is pretty heavily focused on the public sector and it's kind of serious, even though we don't really live our lives necessarily in the public sector. And it seems to come down only as low as the metropolitan level with newspapers and local TV stations. Those were never necessarily our preferences. The internet now is allowing us to redefine news as new information about a subject of common interest shared within any community at all. It could be about government, it could be about our private interests, our vocations, our avocations. It could be about news of friends and family, which if you think about it is what Facebook and MySpace are. And given a preference, we would prefer to hear news that affects us directly. I have this crude diagram here of Leonardo da Vinci's Man in the middle. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that the more direct impact news has on us, the more we tend to be interested in. And the news we're most interested in is, well, private news, we call that news of your household. That's not really news. It's not shared in a community. But that next layer out, personal news, news of family and friends, that's, in my view, why MySpace and Facebook are doing so well. And then there's a direct impact level where we start getting into hyper-local news, news of our vocations and avocations. But the outer ring, remote impact, is really all the news we've had for the last 100 years. Things that are happening across the country and internationally. Occasionally they affect us directly. They rarely do. It's really more, in a lot of cases, it's more diversion than it is necessarily news that we're particularly interested in. This is where I differ from some of my colleagues. It's a very small group of colleagues, so, but here's the things I don't believe where the audiences are going. I don't think we're suddenly going to see audiences change in a great way. I think most people will continue to be observers rather than participants in news. I do believe that content will even more be created by experts as opposed to amateurs, both on the production side and the content side. And I think some of those experts are going to be plucked out of the citizenry. I think people will still prefer news outlets that are the most popular ones. They're not going to necessarily try to figure out everything themselves. Social media, my personal view is it's being oversold a little bit. I think social media is a huge thing. I think it's a very important development, but I think it's going to be more focused on those inner layers, news of family and friends and communities. I don't think social media is going to be nearly as big a deal on what we traditionally think of as news. It will be, obviously, help spread news. It'll be part of the distribution network. I'm also a skeptic on the citizen journalism movement, really for the same reason. And I start wondering sometimes as we talk and we debate it amongst ourselves whether there isn't a little bit of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross creeping in here, Stages of Death and Dying, where citizen journalism may be a little bit more of a bargaining thing where it's like, well, we as journalists will kind of keep our role, but now we'll somehow deal with these pesky citizens, and hopefully they'll still be a part of our system. And finally, this is a slide I do not have enough time to explain everything here, but I just want to give you a sense of my framework for the future of news. The media is actually from a Latin word that means in the middle, and that's what our news has been for the last 100 years. A lot of its clout, a lot of its reasons for success is based upon its position in the supply chain. News sources have not been able to reach news audiences directly. Now that they can with the internet, I still think there'll be middlemen, but I think they're going to look a little different. I think they're going to have to find new ways to add value to justify being in the middle and in order to collect advertising revenue and subscription fees. So I'm seeing a reconstruction of the middlemen. I think we're going to see a lot more opinion. I think we're going to see a lot more aggregating going on. aggregators being people who are experts in the audiences that their news outlets, in whatever form they are, what that audience wants, matching them up with stories. I see huge opportunities for creative writing, which maybe we haven't had so much under the journalism model with objectivity. And I also see kind of crusaders, association leaders. So, and finally, I think we're going to see a much more fragmented news marketplace. General news will be part of it. I think we are going to see a lot of partisan news. It won't necessarily dominate hyperlocal news, news of our jobs, news of our hobbies and interests. Okay? So it's a very bright future in my view. Okay? Thank you.
Does this work? Okay, great.
Yes, I'll make my slides available. I'll put them on my blog too.
Hi, everyone. I have a different perspective. I'm not an expert, but I am an audience member, and I think of myself first and foremost as an audience member. And I'm an audience member who managed to kind of wheedle my way into sort of also writing and providing news in a way. So I'm just going to share with you some thoughts about my experiences and also hopefully riff off of some of these very informative talks we've just heard. I have a lot of friends who are junior faculty or who are graduate students, and it's interesting, one thing that they've told me is that when we were in, for example, when I was in college, I hardly ever went to office hours of any kind. In fact, I think that I only went when I was absolutely required to do so, and the main problem for me, the main anxiety that I had about my schedule when I was in college was trying to wake up before 2:30 p.m. because that was when lunch stopped being served in the dining halls. So I was actually missing like virtually all of my meals, and I thought they're cheating me in this brilliant way, and damn it, I got up at 4 p.m. again. So I didn't actually, I missed a lot of classes, but, I felt like I was still absorbing from my peers, my fellow students. I was still learning a lot. But then, these friends of mine are telling me, these kids are totally different. They always go to office hours. I mean, I sit down, I bring a sandwich, and then suddenly there's just a whole line of people who are, it's insanity. And it's interesting, and, I was kind of thinking through this and talking to them about and it's interesting because it seems their attitude toward adult authority figures is just very different. They're more invested in them, perhaps because, they spent more time with their parents were taking them from one coaching, tutoring session to another. They trust their parents more. They had deeper involvement, but it was also another thought. Now, you can get lectures streaming over the internet. It's very easy to access all kinds of information via JSTOR, LexisNexis. I was kind of at the sort of start of that and did a lot of that. I still went to the library a lot just to kind of hang out. I remember one depressing Friday night when I was reading a biography of Walter Reuther and thinking, you know what, something's gone terribly wrong in my life. But I mean, I think what's happened is that they see, actually the real value added of education is this deeper engagement with these really smart older people who've been around and kind of know a lot about life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to see them, I'm going to ask them a lot of questions. I really want their approval, and I also want to wheedle and negotiate with them in different ways. That really didn't occur to me at all. So I think that, and then I was talking to my boss at The Atlantic and just talking about, the struggles of our business and about how, the part of our business that actually is really flourishing, that's doing very well, is the events business. Some years ago, there was a parody in a right-of-center political magazine called The Weekly Standard about the Weekly Standard cruise that took place on an aircraft carrier. It was like, first stop Tehran, then, North Korea, and we're going to ha-ha-ha. Then, like about a year later, they started an actual Weekly Standard cruise featuring, writers from the Weekly Standard, come, hobnob, etc. And this proved really, really lucrative for them, just as the nations had these cruises for ages, and the National Review has its I'm sorry? Yeah, well, it's one company now, but I actually was talking to a couple of guys in Washington who are hoping to start up a little educational business where they're hoping to have cruises of the mind, come and like sort of hang out with brainy people and come to our hotel and we'll ply you with incredibly cheap food and you'll pay huge amounts of money to talk to us. So it's interesting, I mean, that idea of this kind of deeper engagement being something that's really, really important, the idea of this audience that thinks of itself as sufficiently sophisticated that, I actually know who the bylines are. Or similarly, I remember my my first real foray into public life was writing an incredibly obnoxious letter to the New York Times when I was like 15, 16 years old, and thinking, yes, I really stuck it to the man. And then, some years later, I was actually, actually on the other side and actually kind of vetting and editing these letters and op-ed submissions, most of which are totally insane. But it was just really interesting being on the other end of that, because the sheer volume of stuff that you get and sort of how you negotiate those decisions was really hard for a traditional news organization of that kind. But then later, so here's what I spent my time doing when I was in college, given that I was waking up at 4 p.m. What I did is I read a guy named Andrew Sullivan very closely, who subsequently became a very good friend of mine. He was one of the early-ish political bloggers. There were plenty of bloggers before in the 90s, Linkalists, et cetera, that kind of existed for a long time. But here was a guy who was a pretty recognized opinion journalist who was doing this thing and had a lot of kind of quirky, contrarian opinions. I found this totally addictive, in part because when I was in high school, because I was extremely weird, I did nothing but read the New Republic. I thought of this as this incredibly distant, strange thing. Who are these people who write these magazines? I was actually fascinated by their lives, but completely the way that one is fascinated by, for example, telenovelas. These were people who, had nothing to do with me. They were really different. They were all super sophisticated and, dazzlingly intelligent. And then, in encountering Andrew's website, I was like, oh, he's blogging about his dog, and he's an actual person. So I started emailing him tips. And then in the course of doing that, he was like, well, why don't you, apply for an internship at the New Republic? And I was like, oh, that sounds like an interesting idea. And, my dream throughout life had been becoming a management consultant. When I was 9 years old, I would sleep in a bed with all of these stuffed animals, and I envisioned myself being on a boat that would travel through the world and, solve management problems. But then, I didn't end up doing that. I ended up going to journalism just because of this guy who had a really big influence on me. So, and at that point, the engagement wasn't via comments. Blogs didn't really have comments. You didn't really have the kind of platform for that at the time, or it spread further later. But, he found that actually there were a lot of readers who were terribly smart, and, a lot of his content just became, let me post what these brainy people are saying without actually identifying them by name. So I became the guy who did that. I became the guy who actually filtered all these comments, and these were invariably people who were lawyers, kind of senior associates who were really, bitter about not having accepted that internship at Spy magazine. They were, always people who were actually, usually 10 times smarter than anyone who was actually, a professional opinion journalist, and also people who were, running crazy regressions in their basements, much like the people who fuel the tremendous success of Talking Points Memo, Josh Marshall's site. And Josh Marshall's site has also given rise to, for example, Bill Roggio, who is the blogger behind a wonderful website called The Long War Journal, where, he's a guy who was an infantryman himself and who provides a lot of context for understanding, United States military campaigns. But actually his partner in this blog is a guy who was from Jersey and did IT for a bank and had never been in the military, but who had actually acquired so much knowledge about the stuff that it actually became, really fruitful and interesting for other people to read about. And he also helped Bill actually set up this very neat miniature enterprise. So I think that this has been, kind of my defining experience. And then, kind of after me, I graduated from college in 2001. A guy I also went to college with named Matthew Iglesias, he started blogging. He was the editor of a kind of campus weekly, and, was a kind of minor campus figure, but who kind of became this wildly important figure in the blogosphere because he blogged a lot. Fueled by a lot of caffeine, and was a bright guy who was very good at framing devices. So then, this became this little clique of people who knew each other very well, linked to each other, and, but it actually looked, kind of super professional, and then these guys actually started getting actual jobs with traditional media organizations that were in an utter state of, an utter lather, and another state of panic. When I was at the New Republic, I suggested to a bunch of the junior staff members, hey guys, you should start one of these web blogs. You should start a group web blog, and then you could, it would be a really neat thing to do, and you could, the kind of kibitzing that you do around the office, you just do it in, kind of crude paragraph form. And they thought, they laughed at me, and then actually one of them joined my blog at the time, which was called evilforces.blogspot.com, under the name N de Plume, and another joined under pseudonym because they thought it was actually so embarrassing to actually be involved with the blog that they should use these fanciful names. Now, of course, the New Republic is pretty much exclusively blogs, plus a kind of minor print magazine that comes out, 2 times a month. So, it is very interesting how incredibly fast this has all happened. The person who I think is actually now, obviously we have all these tremendous technological advances, but we had LiveJournal. We had a lot of these technologies before you had this true blogging explosion. And I think that actually a lot of it was an intellectual shift. And actually one of our panelists later today, Eric Alterman, I think is going to be remembered as an incredibly important figure in the history of media. Why is that? Eric Alterman is someone who actually shared the sensibility of his audience rather than the sensibility of his professional class, which is why he felt like, we're actually going to take a confrontational approach versus mainstream media. We're not going to accept that they're always and invariably right. We're actually going to say, this is something that a lot of conservatives had done. They thought of themselves as a besieged minority and created parallel institutions to kind of combat and try to kind of challenge the framing devices of the news. And he thought, the left should do the same thing. But he did this with a very high level of sophistication, a level of a kind of ironic sensibility that actually made it very formidable. What was the upshot of this? The upshot is that I later became a producer at NBC News. While I was there, I was working with colleagues who thought of themselves as kind of good burghers who were kind of broadly left-of-center people. And they, kind of grew up in a media environment where actually the antagonists on the outside were conservatives. So in order to achieve balance, they, kind of were like, okay, well, let's kind of tweak Hillary Clinton a bit. This was something that was very popular. I was totally terrified of doing this. Someone who was moderately right of center, there's a group called Media Matters for America, and I remember waking up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night thinking, oh my God, what if Media Matters, kind of sort of identifies me as a right-winger? So then I pressured my colleagues, never refer to Hillary Clinton as Hillary. Don't do that on a graphic. Don't do that when you're speaking. You must refer to her as Senator Clinton at all times, because anything else is, horrifically sexist. This is the audience, aided by these ringleaders who were actually, sort of terribly bright, strategically minded people, were literally terrifying me, a news producer who earlier wouldn't have actually given a darn about what they were doing because there was actually no two-way interaction. But then there were actually very concerted, organized campaigns of, kind of emailing and what have you. And even though the number of people who email versus the number of people who are actually watching your broadcast is tiny, they're actually much, much scarier. So this is, kind of news for you guys. If you want to terrify people, a news producer or an editor, it's extremely, extremely easy. I mean, it's just a sort of like a very Noam Chomsky sort of had this neat wry observation about how when you're looking at the American populace, there's this idea that a lot of folks have. Oh well, the American public is clearly dopey. That's why they don't sort of respond to the things that Noam Chomsky feels they ought to respond to. But then he said, but listen to sports talk radio and listen to the incredible sophistication with which people are talking about baseball scores, etc. Clearly, the American public is terribly, terribly bright. Now, I don't share Noam Chomsky's political perspective, but I think that when you see what's happened with the television program Lost, which I'm morbidly obsessed with, this is so dizzyingly complex. And the fact that an audience is, the audience's brain is literally growing. I feel much smarter after watching an episode simply by virtue of knowing what the heck is going on. And this is true of many millions of people. Now, the audience for that television program is dwindling, but it is nevertheless, wildly big given the cognitive demand that it's placing on people. And I think that, now when I sort of go to my college campus and sort of chat with people, they know who all of the Times reporters are who cover like the campaign beat. Now, granted, this is a kind of weird group of people already of like news nerds, but I was a news nerd and I didn't know who these people were. I didn't know what their sensibilities were. I didn't know which newspapers they worked for previously. It's really amazing. So actually, there's no real, I don't want to say there's no real respect, but there's certainly no real sense of forbearance or sense that these people are superior to me. There's a sense that these are people basically like me, but instead of actually going to the profession that is my chosen profession, they're people who have gone into this particular news business that has its, particular attractions. And so I'm perfectly happy to judge them. I'm perfectly happy to evaluate them. I work for a magazine called The Atlantic, and what we do well is kind of long-form narrative reporting. 5 seconds or 5 minutes? 5, okay, but 5 seconds, I could say everything I need to say in 5 seconds too. And it's interesting because there is a real kind of, sort of panicky lather about, kind of what the heck are we going to do? Sort of our audience is aging rapidly, and though they're affluent, there are no more tobacco and, sort of alcohol ads in magazines anymore because people are too healthy. Damn them. And yet we're actually sort of, there are a lot of different ideas. I won't bore you about sort of the particulars of kind of the print versus digital strategy. But, it is interesting because, certainly I used to read the newspaper every day, and then I read it on the web every day. Now I don't even do that, embarrassingly. I actually have so many feeds that I subscribe to that I kind of have stories that are broken up into tiny little pieces for me, and I kind of know exactly kind of what I want to get, and I will go to a news story when it seems vital that I do so, but I find that the coverage that I get from the long war journal is generally better than the war coverage I'm going to get from, say, the New York Times or the LA Times in terms of the level of granular detail that I'm looking for. So, you know, clearly what you're going to have to do is offer a kind of more immersive and distinctive experience that sort of there's going to be some number of people who have a taste for it, but you're also going to, you know, I was talking to you earlier about the events business and how crucially important that is in that kind of deep engagement, which can happen sort of literally in person, or it can also happen, you know, electronically. But there is, and I'm not allowed to name it, but there is an events business that's Washington-based that's so wildly successful that they're actually thinking about starting a print magazine. And I was, you know, kind of, why on earth would you do that? I mean, you would say, well, we just have so much money lying around that we need to do something with it. We need to literally set it on fire, and setting up a print magazine seemed like a very good way to do that. So clearly there are going to be a lot of opportunities, you know, kind of in the print world. I mean, as, you know, Steve was suggesting, and actually what I see happening in terms of this audience, I see these increasingly sophisticated Gramscian strategies about audiences that are actually taking ownership of publications that already exist, and also audiences cultivating new publications that don't exist yet. You know, what I mean by this is that, you know, there's this tendency to think that like mavericks or people who are independent-minded, independent of party, are somehow better and less self-interested than people who are narrowly partisan. But of course, that's almost the opposite of true. I mean, partisanship represents these institutionalized disagreements that we have in American life. And so, you know, actually the person is truly not self-interested in the one who's actually trying to resolve and actually trying to strengthen their side of an argument in this kind of ongoing conversation. At least that's my kind of semi-controversial argument. So I think that, you know, you have these two coalitions, given campaign finance regulation, giving a lot of other limitations placed on kind of conventional media, that is inclined towards actually trying to capture a means of information that's a means of actually strengthening your particular coalition and your particular sensibility. So I think that actually we are really going to see a much more flourishing media landscape, but it's going to be one that's not actually paid for through advertising. It's going to be paid for through patronage, ideally through this kind of multi-patronage of engaged audience members like myself. I mean, I donate like $5 through PayPal to a bunch of different websites and stuff because, you know, there are things that I want to see go forward. We're going to see a lot more of that. So yeah. I had a lot more that I wanted to say, but I kind of can't keep track. So, thank you.
Thank you. Questions for the panelists? Surely we have questions based on this. Matt.
So, all of you have expressed, I think, you know, a view of the future where there are more and different streams of data. And in terms of the audience, rather than, you know, somebody who's sitting and looking at the friend feed and looking at tech meme every 10 minutes and all this kind of stuff, this is not the audience, right? You've got to think about, I think, somebody who traditionally has had, you know, half an hour when you're coming from the field to look at some kind of media before they, you know, pass out. And how is that audience going to be able to consume or be involved in the transition of the media if it involves this explosion of background? But how are they going to be able to actually even engage with that and not just fall back on traditional models?
Okay, if I'm understanding you correctly, you know, my solution to this, which doesn't exist yet, it's theory, is that we're going to have a very, very important level of aggregators, news aggregators, who are going to, in a fragmented marketplace, represent different like-minded communities. We can be members of several of them, but I think this is a very, very important skill that's really, as far as I know, not taught in journalism school now. I don't know if anybody even knows how to teach it, but a function where somebody is an expert and creates a news community, creating a news outlet. We're going to have a lot of these. It's not going to be an unmanageable number, I don't think. I'm imagining in my mind just nature being the way it is, or capitalism being the way there is. There'll probably be, for every category, there'll be a big three, let's say. And I think tools will be developed that help people find those. What I don't think is, I think Google, I mean, I love Google. They're doing wonderful things. I think the idea that all of us are going, that the main habit we're going to pick up is every time we have a question, go to Google and ask and find a completely different website. That to me doesn't seem like human nature. I think we're going to fall into habits. We're going to visit the same sites over and over again, and somehow these advertisers will discover us depending on what our purchase habits are, and that, I think that will actually fund it. I think a lot of the advertising will be targeted, segmented toward pure audiences of people who have some common interests, purchase interests. Okay, that's my view.
Go ahead.
I actually disagree a little bit. I mean, I actually do think that when you're looking at the friend feed model, it's something that's actually going to become a lot more pervasive. I think that the other person who I think of as a great sort of news innovator is Leah Pearlman at Facebook, who kind of initiated the Facebook news feed, introducing the idea of the feed to people who kind of weren't accustomed to it. And in terms of people who introduced me to lots of news and also lots of kind of neat viral content, there's a guy named Franklin Leonard, who is a friend of mine on Facebook and who consistently kind of shares these notes that I normally would ignore or not read, but he provides these kind of tantalizing headlines. And again, he's obviously a very miniature version of a kind of Matt Drudge. But I think that to your question, I think that actually the real issue now is providing sort of a lot of data transparency on the part of government. Because insofar as, you're going to have like every block is a group that actually, in terms of crime data and in terms of data on like sort of health code violations at local restaurants, they're getting this stuff pushed out from governments. They're trying to strip it clean and actually use it and present it in an attractive format. I think that that's really going to be the model for the future, which means that investigative journalism, as Starr suggested earlier today, is something that we all legitimately need to be concerned about, because that's a set of very specialized skills, and that's driven by people who actually really have a passion for it and a kind of set of skills that you acquire only over a very long period of time. But I think that otherwise, like sort of myself as someone who's a real news junkie, the fact that I actually don't go to the traditional gatekeepers that much, now it could be that like I'm just part of a kind of eccentric group, but I do think I see this kind of behavior filtering out through kind of a larger circle of people, and I do think that the aggregators are going to be a very large number of people. It's going to happen informally in a very fragmentary way, and it's going to come to you through a variety of different platforms.
I'll just add real quickly, a niche blogger is an aggregator, often, almost always. And people, I think there's a real opportunity for traditional media, which will be the place that a lot of folks retreat for quality, assuming they do their jobs well, forgetting whether they can solve the business model issue, which is very unclear. But even if even though we want to get kind of a general report, each of us has some topic or neighborhood of interest that we're going to have to go somewhere else for, and are actually quite willing to. People in my former neighborhood in California had a mailing list, a simple Yahoo mailing list, that broke news regularly about that cluster of homes. News that was completely below the radar and of the traditional media, including the Palo Alto newspaper, but which was real news in our neighborhood. That's not to be dismissed, and people who do that are not doing it because they're getting paid for it or anything else. They're simply caring about the neighborhood and participating in that conversation. So there'll be a lot of those in niches of geography and topic. The ones you care about, you'll find and participate in, or at least pay attention to. But so there again, I do think the diversity is promising in that category.
Questions? Shirley.
I was just wondering, maybe it's already been covered, but it seems to me that the specialization of news is kind of encouraging news to be entertainment. So like the most emailed articles are really not articles for which I feel that I need to know, but maybe interesting to know. And that if I subscribe to blogs which are only in my interest, there's a reduction in like serendipitous news that where if I'm just listening to BBC News in the morning, they're telling me content for which I could be asked and I would say I don't care about, but which informs me in depth. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like this is going to diminish, or that there's actually an alternative outlet for that in the future?
Okay. Let's start.
The question was serendipity, and how are we going to have it in the future of things that we didn't know we cared about until we saw it, right? Well, I have several places I go for that. One is called Boing Boing, a blog that is full of things that I had no idea I cared about until I saw it. And we're going to have a replacement. There's also that you're also alluding to the echo chamber issue and worry, which actually I'm not so worried about, because people, even if they want to, people do tend to look first at things they're likely to agree with politically. But the beauty of the web and the beauty of the hyperlink is that on the web, there's usually a link from a blogger on one side saying that idiot said, and that said is linked. So you can go see what that idiot said. And that's a lot better than what we have now. where it's one television network that says this is fair and balanced when we know that's not true, but without any real link to the other side. And we're going to see more and more of that on the air, but not. We can fix that online. That's a nice part of this.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think in general what's going to happen is this thing that we've been calling news is going to be a smaller and smaller share of the news we're consuming. I think news as it's been defined has been defined in this modern journalism context. It tends to lean more than the average person might toward what's happening in the public sector and the serious things. So I think that's going to in general be a smaller share. I think we're also going to learn that a lot of what we've been consuming as news has really been entertainment. Some of it kind of sick. I mean, the kidnappings and all that, which is part of our news, or the celebrities. It's appealing to different interests we have that journalism has been unwilling to fulfill. And when I look forward to assuming all media are going to converge onto the internet, I think a lot of news people are going to find they're in the entertainment business. Because they're going to be on the same platform, one mouse or whatever device it ends up being, but one mouse click away from TV programs, films, video games, porn, blogs. I think it's all going to look kind of similar. It's like, well, I've taken my mind off my worries or what I'm doing right now. I want to be distracted. Nobody thinks like that, but I think that's what entertainment is, and it's going to have to compete. So, I expect a lot of what's news now is going to have to become a lot more entertaining and sensational, whether we like it or not, just because it's going to be competing against all these other forms on the same platform.
It's interesting. I mean, this speaks to this broader question about sorting mechanisms and how much more efficient our sorting mechanisms as a culture have become, ranging from like a sortative marriage to, the fan circles of like niche blogs. For example, I heard a very similar argument in the context of conscription recently. If we had military conscription, a lot more of us would know about what's going on in Iraq because, we would actually have relatives or we'd have friends. And actually, as it turns out, in terms of the journalistic profession, like upper middle class people, actually less likely that they do, also given sort of elite education and sort of underrepresentation in the military. So I actually think that kind of serendipity you're talking about, there are going to be people who have a taste for it. The magazine The Week, which is kind of explicitly billed as an aggregator, has actually been a wild success precisely because they set out to kind of introduce that sort of thing. And obviously, the kind of news and chat provided by an NPR no longer requires public subsidy because it's been so popular. But I think for people who don't really want it, I mean, they're not going to get it. And also, this is a constituency that's generally been kind of underserved or uninterested by news, including a lot of my friends. So I think that that's whether or not that's a problem is the kind of more the question from my perspective.
Yes.
I look at the development of hardware and software in the context of distributed processing, if you will. When you look at the Apple II or the IBM PC, all that hardware was developed by having masses and masses of people working on it at the same time. And of course, the web is an extension of that. But we seem to have entered into a new domain whereby with, if you will, the masses of the unwashed people all having access to the web now. I wonder if we won't get to kind of a Garrison-Keillor effect where we'll get to the lowest common denominator. Does that worry you, gentlemen?
Well, there's a term for this. Jaron Lanier referred to digital Maoism, talking about sort of a lot of, Web 2.0 venues and about how they actually sort of are producing nothing but pap. And I think that I actually don't really buy that, just because I think that, what we've seen is a kind of sharp fragmentation of culture. And so, you have people who are kind of very interested in sort of things of sort of like high quality. Perhaps they would share your sensibilities. And I think that actually the means for them, the generative means, the technological means for them to actually do their work well has kind of sharply increased. And of course, kind of people who are doing kind of half-assed experiments that sort of end up sort of being a very low quality also have an opportunity because the barriers to entry are lower. But I think that actually, when I see the blogosphere and the number of people who kind of are brilliant people who never would have considered careers as journalists before, but actually stumbled into it because of the lower barriers to entry. And this is just kind of a canary in a coal mine because you can actually copyright the news. I think that it actually speaks very well to the future of sort of culture and software, broadly speaking.
I think, at the bottom of this issue, I think is a question of how much faith you have in marketplaces on one hand versus trained, elites, to use that word, as another, and whether you believe the marketplace will sort this out so the quality will rise to the top. I'm pretty optimistic that the quality will rise to the top. People will tend to go to the better places. But, I'm not a Pollyanna on this. I realize there will always be groups who really don't like quality or have their own thoughts about the way the world works, and conspiracy people. I think they'll also have their own news outlets. So it's really, to me, a question of, do you believe that the marketplace will take care of it? Or do you think the marketplace will do a better job? This is really the better question than having a few sophisticated elites educated to that do. And I know which side Thomas Jefferson would come down on. He would trust the marketplace, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's the right answer. I think this honest people can disagree on what the best outcome is.
I don't have a lot to add. I think we've already had a market failure in traditional media that the biggest selling newspapers are the ones at the checkout stand at the supermarket. The most watched television news in this country is, all Brittany all the time. So not clear to me that we could get much worse off on the problem that you're identifying. But I think the chances that we can, again, through a combination of machine and human intelligence in the next few years, surface and push up to the notice of people the good stuff is pretty promising. And again, it's not going to be easy, and it's going to be extremely messy, but I think we have a chance of improving the situation pretty dramatically over time.
That would imply that your newstrust.net would not be necessary, then, wouldn't it?
I think it's one interesting tool getting us toward that. And there are many things in development that I think are exciting about this, but if it's the baseball metaphor, we're in the second inning or something like that.
Way in the back.
An argument was made earlier that certain factors, because they reduce the number of voices in the news, were lower the utility, which seems to, the premise there seems to be that anything that reduces the number of voices reduces the utility, which I don't particularly agree with. So my question is, if you were looking at, say, two systems for the two news landscapes, how would you judge whether one system is better than the other? Is it simply the number of voices, or are there other factors?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is I'm not sure it's for me to judge or necessarily anyone else to judge. I think the marketplace is going to judge it. I wouldn't quite have phrased it the way you did, that it reduces its utility. The point I was really making was that Thomas Jefferson, for instance, and the other founding fathers generally had this belief that you get to the truth by hearing a lot of voices, and somehow the truth will emerge, or at least the consent of the governed will emerge, which is really more to the point, because this was a country built upon the will of the people. I'm sorry? I couldn't hear.
Could you stand up, please?
Just speak louder, please.
Thomas Jefferson actually favored institutionalization of the two-party system.
I still couldn't hear.
That was more Madison, perhaps, not Jefferson.
Well, I mean, I used that quote that he felt that nature had no better way to get to the truth other than this attack and defense and debate. And he believed that, I'm not selecting news out separately. We have plenty of systems in the U.S. that work exactly the same way. I would say our electoral system works exactly the same way. I would say our legal system works the same way, where you have two opposing forces putting out their arguments as opposed to an elite judge making those decisions. I would say the stock market works that way, where thousands and millions of transactions decide on any given day what the price of a share of General Motors is. So this is a system that really is throughout our entire American culture. It hasn't been applied to news for the last 100 years. So it's not a very radical idea, I don't think. It's just basically saying that news is going to join a marketplace just like everything else, including all the goods we buy for that matter, and what the price is and how that's figured out. News is going to just become another item that's debated in the marketplace as to its value and what the definition of good, bad, and popular is.
I just want to add briefly, I mean, it's not so much that increasing the number of voices is good per se. I mean, but it's more the idea of there being a real cultural shift in terms of one's attitude towards consumption that could be a salutary development insofar as, I mean, a lot of things that begin as hobbies end up actually being generative and sort of terribly creative in a lot of, kind of fun, surprising ways. I mean, so obviously the homebrew computing club became something that was much, much more important. So we don't really know where it's going to end up, but the idea, for example, of knitting circles that have had explosive growth, and this is something that began with the so-called alpha geeks in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, and it's spread far and wide. Now, is society better off with more people who are knitting? I'm not sure, but I mean, is society better off with, people finding an alternative to some, kind of more soul-deadening activities? I don't know. I mean, I'm not, but it does seem pretty neat, and who knows what kind of neat technologies are going to emerge out of this, and also the idea of a kind of craft economy where there are going to be more people who actually are going to be able to pursue their bliss, so to speak, using something like Etsy. So I think that actually it's the whole idea of actually having a different attitude toward consumption that's more active than passive. That's something that, kind of you begin by commenting on a blog, then you start your own, and then you actually just have a very different attitude toward public life. That, I think is good and constructive.
Real quickly, the orders of magnitude more people are creating stuff. The vast majority of which is not interesting to me or to most of us. But the law of big numbers says that a tiny percentage that is still going to be a really big number and a bigger number than we have now. Again, it comes down in some senses to how are we going to sort it out to get the really good stuff for the things we care about. And that's still open. But again, there's so much more out there, and some of it is really wonderful.
That guy.
A lot of what we've been talking about is a tremendous amount of freedom and so forth in the internet and the ability to many voices to talk. But we know that governments don't always like that, and we know from the history of the free press that the First Amendment is not self-actualizing, and that the establishment press that everybody talks badly about has spent a lot of time and effort defending that and expanding that. I think that there's a lot of naivete among bloggers and people. They just take all of that for granted, and at some point, as you say in China or places, or Burma, or Myanmar, the governments are finding ways to crack down and control things. And then even in this country, we have the issue of net neutrality, which could be a serious problem. What are your thoughts on how we preserve a free journalism or whatever, free news in the future, and what are the threats that
Wow, I think I finally found somebody who agrees with me on that particular issue. That is one of my soapboxes on my blog. I'd be writing about it more often, but my hits suffer whenever I talk about it. I feel like I'm talking to myself. In the historical perspective that I gave, that troubles me a great deal, because that is the history of technology. It seems like every time we get a new technology, the government wants to be there first, controlling it, which is the antithesis of what our country is supposed to be. I am a lot more concerned than just about everyone else on net neutrality, not so much for the technical issues it represents, which are pretty difficult to understand and comprehend, and it's hard to imagine there being a real problem if it was implemented. My concern is, to use that phrase, a slippery slope of once the government takes a position and says, yes, we have a stake in the internet, this is a public resource, you've really lost the line from which they can cross. So I'm very, very much in favor of keeping the government out of the internet. There's going to be thousands of good reasons for them to get involved. We're going to hear about obscene language, but sooner or later, what you're going to have, if it goes like anything else, is then we'll start hearing about hate speech, and then we'll have the legal profession saying, no, you libeled that person. And I think at that point, we may have lost our historic opportunity for the internet to be this unprecedented development in free speech. So, the answer to I don't know the answer to your question. I watch the FCC nervously. I wish they would stop talking about the internet. I wish people would stop lobbying them to regulate the internet. That's why I'm very, very wary of net neutrality. It's not because of the issue itself. I just don't want this precedent set. but I agree with you. I would like legislators to be more aware of this historic opportunity we have that, frankly, based on history, I think we're going to lose. I have to be honest. I can't bet in favor of it, given what we've seen throughout history.
I have a friend who's a lecturer at Harvard Law School. He focuses on human rights stuff, and he actually is cooking up a scheme for a kind of guerrilla spread of WiMAX technologies through the kind of unfree world. The idea of sort of giving people who are in a position to kind of be able to get their messages out and also get messages in. I don't know how viable this is going to be, but it certainly seems as though we have a lot of disruptive technologies that you're absolutely right, oppressive governments are able to kind of use in jujitsu and manipulate. I mean, in Burma, they don't really care about text messages because they have a network of informants throughout the entire population, so you can freely text message as much as you want, and an informant is going to say, hey, this guy is a dissident who is going to have to go to jail, and boom, it's done. So, I mean, it depends on like the kind of penetration that happens through a population. When you have this kind of biopolitical control over like individuals at that fine-grained level, you don't really worry about technologies, and that's something that, kind of I think some more, kind of utopian sort of, projections of what this technology, but it doesn't mean that actually it's not actually doing a lot of good, and certainly we're getting a lot more messages out of oppressive countries than we would in the absence of these technologies. So I think that, overall, it's certainly something to be happy and pleased about.
Kevin.
Can I make a quick point about that? I mean, I've talked to a lot of people in China, and they're actually really upset because they say all you focus on is censorship here, and that there's actually lots and lots of stuff going on the internet in China, and that anyone who wants to get around the firewall actually can. Now, I think that that's not to say that the government doesn't restrict it quite a lot, but the nice thing about the internet as it stands right now is that it's built to root around problems, and one of those problems might be someone trying to control what you think, whether it's the government or somebody else. So, I mean, there are ways to get around that if you need to. And I think if it stopped being an open system, and I think this is what Jonathan Zittrain's concerned about, then that's when you worry. It becomes something where instead of being able to make those changes to the network, you can kind of lock down. That's when the internet is going to be AOL.
There are a lot of potential choke points. The questions we have to be asking ourselves, very, very hard questions, as how do we identify them as they're being created, and how do we counter them and with the lightest possible touch from government. But the law applies to people creating stuff online just as much as it does to someone writing in any traditional medium or broadcasting. It's a fallacy if a blogger thinks that he or she is somehow exempt from defamation law. It's ridiculous. And I'm a project I co-founded at Harvard Law. It's called Citizen Media Law Project, which is specifically designed to work on this stuff. And I'd encourage you to talk to David Ardia, the director of that. It's this is important stuff. And on net neutrality, I'm skeptical of the legislation, specific legislation that's been proposed so far, because I worry about unintended consequences. But the people who worry about the consolidation of media in the traditional sense, of a few corporations owning a lot of outlets, should focus their attention on the question of whether in any given community, at most 2 or maybe 3 competitors, put that in quotes, an oligopoly or duopoly, or in some cases monopoly, decides what bits get delivered at what speed and what order, if they get delivered at all. That's a consolidation of media that ought to scare the hell out of everybody in this room.
Additional questions?
Somebody mentioned aggregators as parasites, and I'm in the traditional media. I work for Star Ledger in Newark. And it's very easy for an aggregator to make money, like Google or Drudge Report or Huffington Post. Their overhead is little. They employ virtually no news gatherers, and they feed off the traditional media, which is paying a lot of money to provide that news. If you do a Google search or if you go to the Drudge Report, odds are you end up with a report from the traditional media, predominantly newspapers. What do you envision the world will look like in, say, 10 years, as newspapers and traditional media have to lay off journalists, lose advertising, lose circulation, in essence, just lose the financial resources to employ foot soldiers who go out there to tell the stories. As aggregators gather up their advertising dollars and revenue, who will look out, who will fight the legal battles with corporate America, with the government, to ensure that the American people get honest, unbiased news and have the resources to dig deep to find evidence?
I have to jump on that one. I'm sorry. I think you're combining two different situations and reaching to something that doesn't justify your concern in one part, and that is that the issue of whether the Star-Ledger and other important journalism outlets have the resources to do the journalism in the future has almost nothing whatever to do with aggregators. It has everything to do with the systematic separation, as I said earlier, of advertising from the journalism that's going on everywhere. And the aggregators are basically pointing at your stories, and if it really bothers you, then it's quite easy with technical means to stop them from pointing. And if you think that solves your problem, by all means give it a try, but I suspect it doesn't.
I think you misunderstand my question. I think the aggregators are good in the sense they're sending traffic to us, so I don't mind that. They're not giving us anything for it. I do mind that.
Why should they give you something for sending traffic to you? I'm unclear on that.
Well, maybe they shouldn't, but they wouldn't have anything to point at if we weren't spending money to create.
That's an absolutely separate issue. The fact that they're pointing at your stuff, and yes, they will probably have less to point to of the kinds of things you do today. And I'm worried about the fact that we're going to see less of this good stuff you do today. But I just don't think that is an issue that is related to your business problem otherwise. If you want to ask them nicely to send you a tip, that would be, put a tip jar up. But I don't think that there's any legitimate right of news organizations to ask for money from aggregators. I think it's fair use.
My question wasn't an argument about aggregators being good or bad. Obviously, for the traditional media, they are a bit of a problem. They're perceived as a problem. They're also good in a sense. But I just wanted to know, in 10 years, how do you envision, the in-depth journalism, the investigative journalism, the kind of journalism that requires huge financial resources to be done? We're
going to lose a fair amount for at least a while of what we have today. I don't dispute that, and I'm not happy about that. But I don't think it has anything to do with aggregation. And how we're going to replace it in a number of ways. The nonprofit world is starting to see why community journalism matters, starting to step up to that. There's a lot of good investigative work going on. There is an investigative journalism business model that actually doesn't involve advertising that seems to work pretty well. It's called The Book. There's a number of things that are going to fill in part of it. People can work together in a lot of ways. We haven't even explored the kind of crowdsourcing stuff that's possible. But again, I'm not Pollyannish on that. We are going to lose some important stuff at least for a while.
Yeah, and I agree we are going to lose that important stuff for a while, but let me take it from a different angle too. I think if you're thinking that the way your paper is providing news now will be the same as 5 years from now, I think you've got to start bringing down some of these barriers. What is preventing your newspaper from becoming an aggregator itself and building additional value as a middleman by adding things, doing the same things that aggregators are doing, opinion, creativity, crusading? I mean, those are things that could be your future business model. I would also suggest that a lot of the reporting that's going on is coming from, I mean, let's be honest here, a lot of news starts somewhere. It starts from a public relations firm or a spokesperson in a politician's office or there. I think a lot of this reporting function is going to have to be outsourced, that's the wrong word, to them, so that the news outlets can concentrate on the things that add higher value in a world where the news can flow directly from a news source to the news audience. So I think newspapers these days have to start thinking about shifting their models, learning from what these people are doing successfully, which is basically creating new reasons to be middlemen, and start incorporating those. And I'm very bullish. I think old media can do this, but they need to start thinking in terms of shifting and adding value to what they're doing.
Matt?
I just wanted to address what Dan was saying, because I think it doesn't respect the ecology that exists between journalists and the aggregator. So if you take a very extreme view, let's say we just had Google News and we had everybody writing about it. So there's this thing which I call the tyranny of preferential attachment. So Google News has to decide, okay, what gets to the top. So it has an algorithm which is based on essentially a notion of popularity. Right? These are the stories, and there's a cluster of stories which are kind of similar, and so those are the things that are going to be at the top. So that becomes a gateway to it does pass traffic to news sites, but it controls which news sites get exposed and to which traffic gets pushed. Okay, so if you wanted to play in that game as a news source, you would think, well, how can I get on that thing? Well, I know that if I publish this AP news article, Google's algorithm will say, okay, these 1,000 places are all publishing the same article, that story is going to get on the top. So why would you not conform your editorial process or whatever to optimize your chances of getting to the top of the aggregator? So it's not, I know where you're coming from in the sense that it's not necessarily the case that they should pay to pass traffic because they're getting something for free, but it's an ecology. They're not separated, and so there is definite concern around the dynamics that push that ecology. And I would actually say it comes down to what metric is used in that algorithm. Is it popularity, or is it some other quality? And I would suggest the other qualities, at least the ones I care about, are to do with being better informed and being more efficient at being better informed. And popularity is not the same as those two things.
All right. You've identified one of the big problems of Google News, and one of the major issues is that it's not transparent in terms of how they do what they do, and they're quite actively not telling us what goes into the algorithm, or even what the sources are. So this is a place where we need vastly more competition, and I hope that your company will be providing a lot more competition and doing it in a more open way, because we need it.
That being Microsoft.
That's Microsoft, by the way.
Let me just throw in one thing really quick. I think we can make mistakes by thinking that this is a process that machines can do all by themselves. The kinds of issues we're talking about and what makes attractive stories, I don't think there's a robot, a computer, or whatever, that can do this alone and do it well without human judgment. So I don't think algorithms in Google News are going to replace the need for instance, aggregators and others who can apply human judgment to it. So I don't know that we should be looking at Google News as the future of news. Personally, I don't think Google News is the future of news. I see Google doing a number of wonderful things that can stream off businesses in news, such as the news clips. But the idea that we're going to all be looking at the same homepage with the same Associated Press stories does not strike me as moving in the direction of where we're heading.
Just very briefly, it's also true that, Google News, as you know, they also look to reputation in this very vague way, so that, for example, weblog posts associated with The Atlantic actually, kind of receive a kind of hierarchically speaking a higher rank ordering than others. It's very quirky stuff. Memorandum has the Memorandum leaderboard where they actually identify which are kind of the most cited sources, and the ones that are clustered at the top tend to be from professional news organizations. The Politico is very high up, the kind of general newspapers, as well as so it is interesting, but it's also, there's the piece of social reproduction that I think is important to pay attention to. When people talk about this as a very free environment, actually there's a lot of under news in terms of how those relationships are built. There are a lot of people who aggressively lobby Matt Drudge. In fact, actually some have accused Matt Drudge of having arrangements with personal friends that are sort of remunerative for both parties involved in order to kind of shift traffic in one direction or another. So actually there is not a lot of transparency in this, comprehensively speaking, and it's certainly something that is worthy of some attention. But I think that, the reaction is not so much a kind of, it has, the defensive reaction is actually to kind of create alternatives rather than to kind of try to prize them open, because I don't see that being a terribly sort of productive approach.
Thanks. Let's continue the discussion during the break, and we'll reconvene at 3:30 with the panel on the economics of news. Thanks.